Welcome to Silicon Curtain. Now I know you're going to like this video, so please do make sure you like at the end. Check you're subscribed so that you don't miss any content. And before we get into this, I'd like to thank everybody who has helped support the channel through Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee, and in other ways as well by leaving helpful, fantastic comments against the videos. It really helps. And as you know from previous videos, this is now the main thing I do, so it's more important than ever to get your support. Please also check out the validated Ukrainian charities that appear in the description of the video. It's incredibly important to help Ukrainian charities at this point, especially ones which are involved in the war effort, because as expected, donations have dropped off when you compare it to last year and the year before, and there's a real need there. Today, I am absolutely delighted to be talking to Mark Galeotti, who is an author and academic. By training, he's an historian, and in practice, an interdisciplinary scholar with interests encompassing politics, criminology, security studies, international relations, and anthropology. He is a specialist in transnational and organized crime, security affairs, Russian intelligence, and many other topics. He is principal director at Mayak Intelligence and an honorary professor SSES at UCL. He hosts as well the highly acclaimed podcast In Moscow's Shadow. And if you're not subscribed to that, I strongly recommend that you do. If there's limited time in the day, but I think you should definitely make space for that. Mark, welcome back to the channel.
Well, good to be back here, and thanks, of course, for the plug for the podcast.
No, there are so many sources of information out there. Some of them are geared up to entertainment. Some of them have genuinely impactful information, high concentration of information, and yours is definitely one of those. Well, let's start with a topic that perhaps hasn't got, I think, nearly as much traction as it should, and that is the dramatic shootout at Wildberries, which is the equivalent of Amazon. A bunch of Chechen gangsters, I believe, turned up at the Moscow office, had a bit of a shootout. A few people were killed, and it's extraordinarily reminiscent of the 1990s. But is that perhaps to put too simplistic an interpretation on it? Is there something quite different going on here? And does it reveal the fault lines of potential future power struggles if Putin's regime was to fragment and fracture?
Well, I wouldn't want to posit it as too much of a grand indicator of the future. In many ways, this is exactly a 1990s style business dispute with 2020's characteristics, because you have this, phenomenally successful company, the kind of sort of Russian answer to Alibaba, or indeed sort of in its new largely post-book incarnation, Amazon. And a rivalry in, basically between the couple who actually sort of, well, I said the couple who run it. I mean, actually, it's the wife who really was the powerhouse behind the creation of Wildberries. They're divorcing. Her husband wants his cut. And interestingly enough, what's happening at the moment is Wildberries is going through a merger with a rather odd partner. It's a company that basically does advertising billboards. Not really anything like the same kind of sort of traction in the market or indeed market share, but nonetheless, this clearly has been blessed by the Kremlin. So one presumes that someone somewhere is getting suitably rich off it. Whereas the husband actually turned to Ramzan Kadyrov of Chechnya, who denounced this as essentially raiding. And then, as you mentioned, he turns up in Moscow offices Wildberries with a whole collection of thugs, most of which actually were sportsmen, but as in master of sports in various martial arts and things. Yes, absolutely. A certain number were Chechens, or else actually was essentially under the, how I say, the umbrella of the wider kind of Chechen community. Quickly degenerates into, from a tussle into a firefight, and the police hurriedly arrive. And why this is interesting, apart from just simply being a great callback to the past for someone like me who could cut their teeth on the overt criminality of the 1990s, is precisely that this is actually taking place in the center of Moscow. This kind of overt thuggish violence, certainly so closely in the public view and with such a major company, really had no longer been a feature of Russian business. it was the sort of thing you might find down in the North Caucasus or out in distant Siberia still a little, but not here, and not a company of this scale. And arrests have followed and such like. What's interesting is it suggests two things. One is if we look at the Chechen connection, Kadyrov, as ever, being fairly brazen in supporting those who are on his side or who pay him off, and to a degree, clearly not fearing retaliation for being involved in this. So that says something about how comfortable he feels at the moment. He knows full well that at the moment, with everything that's going on in Ukraine and elsewhere, there is no way that the Kremlin is going to have any appetite for trying to lean on him. And at the same time, it says something about the overall environment in Russia. To a large extent, basically the changed business environment under Putin was a combination of two things. First of all, the state's return, the fact that the state was now much more willing again to impose the laws and such like. And secondly, the fact that for much of this time, except for certain sort of blips around 2008 and so forth, the national cake has been expanding. And therefore, everyone, the question was really, can I get a slightly larger slice rather than anything else? Now, as in many ways it shrinks, unless you're directly involved in the defense industrial complex, the squabbles to retain your slice of the cake become that much more fierce. And we are generally seeing a return to the sort of bad old culture of so-called raiding, seizing assets through extra-legal means. In the main, this means paying off a judge to sort of say, yes, this is indeed a legitimate debt or something like that. But in extreme cases, it manifests like Wildberries. So again, it's one of many indicators, not in and of itself a sign of a dramatic change, but part of an overall body of evidence suggesting, again, that the state is no longer as powerful. I mean, remember, courtesy of the special military operation, quote unquote, the police are something like a quarter to a third under strength at the moment. So, the state is weaker, the state is distracted, and at the same time, as I said, particularly outside the defense industrial complex, the national cake is getting smaller, and therefore the squabbles, the rivalries over who controls what are getting that much more vicious.
All your engagement with the videos on this channel is massively appreciated, as well as encouraging comments and the financial support you provide. Some of you will have donated to Ukrainian charities, including the ones listed in the descriptions of these videos. I know many of you ask how you could be doing more to help Ukraine, and that includes me. Well, here is news of a project that I think could make a huge difference. It's been initiated by Silicon Curtain, and I hope will support Ukrainians on the ground and in the diaspora and create real impact to help ensure a Ukrainian victory. It's a documentary film to be made in Ukraine later this year and shown internationally, hopefully at film festivals and on Silicon Curtain as well. We aim in the film to follow the 75th aid convoy to Ukraine by a remarkable team based in Poland, delivering vital medical, humanitarian, and military aid that helps Ukrainians remain resilient. No doubt the efforts of this team has saved innumerable lives of Ukrainian servicemen and women fighting on the front line of freedom. We have a unique opportunity to share authentic stories on the world stage through this film, via film festivals, social media, and streaming to Silicon Curtain. The film will provide a counterweight to Russian propaganda films such as Russians at War. It will show spontaneous stories gathered on the journey as we travel the length of the front line. Filming footage and interviews along the journey, we will have a unique opportunity to convey the shared humanity and common cause of Ukrainians living with war. The film will focus on stories of hope and resilience with the war as a backdrop and aims to create a compelling narrative and tone that is entirely authentic. Well, here's the important bit. We're aiming to raise £12,000 to record the dog sled tournament and create a stunning trailer for the project. Overall, the project will cost up to $100,000 for end-to-end production and distribution. For the price of a DVD rental or a streamed movie, you could help create a film that raises awareness of Ukraine's struggle and generates funds for further aid convoys. Supporters of the film will get early access to see it and free access to the film for all time. This is a bold and ambitious project, but it will be led by an experienced documentary team with a professional cinematographer. It is time, I think, to join together to achieve something powerful and unique for Ukraine. After reviewing many project ideas, we feel that this is the best way that we can have an impact. Tentatively titled To the Edge of Freedom, here is a short description of the film. A world champion dog sled racer navigates dangerous obstacles through the apocalypse-like battle zones of Ukraine's front line, delivering life-saving aid to ordinary heroes engaged in extraordinary acts of valor. Igor Traks, the team leader, is a remarkable personality and relentless supporter of Ukraine throughout the full-scale war. The film starts in Finland at the World Championship Dog Sled Tournament with Igor. Fresh from his 11th World Championship in dog sled racing, Igor Trans leads his foundation's 75th humanitarian mission to the front lines of war-torn Ukraine. For this mission, Igor's team is joined by a few friends from the US and UK who will not only provide hands-on support, but share what they learn on the ground with news sources in the West. Our cameras follow Igor from Finland to Gdansk, to Lviv, to Mykolaiv, Kherson, to Dnipro, Pokrovsk, Kharkiv, and other frontline cities facing the brunt of Russian aggression. Along the way, they will meet colourful and determined individuals fighting for their families' right to survive. Igor and his team navigate life and death situations to bring much-needed supplies, visiting bunkers, hospitals, and units whose success may not merely determine the fate of this ancient culture, but of the West itself. The film will follow Igor's latest aid convoy to the front line and back again. I hope this description will inspire you to become part of the film project and make a difference to the war's outcome, a war that Ukraine must win clearly and decisively. Please do find the donation link in the description of the video and do reach out to me if you have any questions at all about the project and its intended impact. And for those looking at it as this extraordinary outbreak of lawlessness, it's actually been pointed out that this is not necessarily uncommon. In fact, the regime has relied on the implicit threat of Chechen thuggery for much of Putin's existence. So even if it wasn't necessarily deployed with frequency or deployed in this fashion, there's always been this ability to have recourse to extreme lawlessness. And it's an interesting topic, isn't it? And it's one which diaspora Russian oppositionists have brought up, that the foundation of Putin's regime is really this ability to wield this kind of threat and thuggery. Is there any chance of
Not
Putin?
through Chechens, though.
No.
I mean, I think I disagree there. You see, the Chechens are a problem rather than an asset. I mean, when the state wants to use violence, it has umpteen methods at its disposal. It's got the Federal Security Service. It's got the police. Chechens are very much Kadyrov's people. And Kadyrov, on the one hand, for all that he loudly professes his devotion to Putin, in practice, he's often blackmailing Putin. As soon as there's any talk of reducing the massive state subsidies to Chechnya, huge proportion of which just gets siphoned off to pay for Kadyrov's extravagant lifestyle, his massive fleet of luxury cars, his personal zoo, his vanity projects, and everything else. Whenever there's any threat to that, that's when Kadyrov basically causes trouble. Maybe he says, oh, maybe it's time for me to retire, knowing full well that the Kremlin doesn't have an alternative. Or actually, I mean, in the most extreme case, he invades a neighboring region of Russia, as he did with Ingushetia, sending police over the border to try and more or less, in practice, annex a contested village. So, I mean, in this respect, I think that what it says is not so much about the state's capacity to deploy violence, because in many ways the Chechens were semi-independent. I mean, I once stayed at the President Hotel back when I could still travel to Russia which has become basically the sort of the HQ of the Chechens in Moscow. It's where Adam Demikhanov, who is the senator for um, Chechnya, sort of lives and such like. And one morning I thought, well, I was up early. I thought incautiously, oh, I'll go to the gym, and I sort of opened the door, and it was full of large, muscular Chechens pumping iron for all their worth. And I thought maybe I'll go for a walk instead. But very much you got that sense that it was an enclave unto itself, as they all, clearly with bulging armpits and so forth, piled into big black Mercedes G wagons and just sort of roll around the city. You know, so actually, it's more, I think, a symptom of the state's inability to control sort of unruly kind of agents sometimes, but also just simply self-interested figures, than actually a sort of a sign of the state itself deploying this violence. Because certainly the state was on the other side in this particular dispute.
And that was going to be my next question about potentially sort of losing control, because of course there's this superficially attractive narrative of decolonization, Chechen independence, and Russia's going to fall apart, etc. But it sounds like they've got a pretty good deal here. If they were to gain independence from the Russian state, then all this largesse, this flow of money, booty would cease. So actually, it doesn't seem, at least for the current cadre controlling Chechnya, that there's really much incentive for full independence. In effect, they have a kind of independence, and they have this incredible access to a sort of Danegeld, as it were. Pay us off,
Mm.
and we'll not unleash our nastiness on you.
Yeah, and this is it. I mean, you use that good parallel of Danegeld, and the old saying was, once you start paying Danegeld, you never get rid of the Dane. I can't help feeling that, although, look, I don't believe that there's any likelihood of the Russian Federation as a whole breaking apart, or indeed that there being much desire for that. But on the other hand, if one looks at the North Caucasus in general and Chechnya in particular, I can't help feeling that most Russians would love to give it its independence, because precisely this is an area that they see it's a source of trouble, of danger, of thugs, of criminality, and also yet one that they're having to pay for through the nose. So yes, I think that Kadyrov, he's not, I think it's fair to say, an especially deep thinker, but nonetheless, he has a certain feral cunning in his capacity to continue to blackmail Moscow, which I think actually has sort of almost exaggerated the potential Chechen threat. But nonetheless, for whatever reason, they know absolutely in the moment there's no way they could afford a new Chechen war. And therefore, he regards himself as being in a particularly strong position, not just simply because of his forces that he's deploying to the invasion, because they often don't actually do much fighting, but the implicit fear that if we do not back Kadyrov, we will find ourselves with another Chechen insurgency and everything that means. And he plays that to the hilt.
Well, we're going to turn to a topic of money now and the Russian economy. And I went to an event yesterday with Michael Sheridan talking about China, and lots of interesting stuff there about China's relationship with Russia. And of course, in the last couple of months, under pressure of secondary sanctions, China has withdrawn a lot of the support, the credit, and the financial instruments that were provided to Russia, which really were underpinning the import-export economy and one has to say part of the war effort. Now, there's two interesting things that seem to be happening. One is that financial support seems to be going away under pressure of secondary sanctions, and that's a huge threat, which a lot of Russian diaspora commentators talk about an awful lot, which but doesn't get too much discussed for some reason in the Western media. But the other topic, of course, is the increasing evidence of of China rather, not just sort of supplying night vision stuff and clothes and this and that, but a lot more. There's evidence of wide scale sort of food rations being provided, turning up in Ukraine with sort of Chinese characters on, but also talk of not just components for drones, but something like 80% of Russia's drone capacity is now directly supplied by China. It is rumored, it has to be said. It's difficult to get evidence for this. So how do you explain these twin things, withdrawal and almost sort of hedging their bets on the one side, or, preventing themselves getting burnt by withdrawing, economic and financial support, but on the other hand, potentially, I wouldn't say going all in, but providing this military support?
I think it's clear that China as a state is supporting Russia. It may not truly care that much about what happens in Ukraine, but it does care that Moscow should not lose. So I think there's no question about that. But then there's also the fact that China is operating, the Chinese state is operating through a whole plethora of businesses, many of which do not precisely want to find themselves in the crosshairs of Western, which essentially means American sanctions. And so you have this interesting tension. I mean, I was seeing a story this morning about precisely because of the troubles in actually transferring payments of Russian businesses being paid back by Chinese firms in mandarins, and I assume they mean the fruit rather than imperial bureaucrats. Um, and in that context, I think that what we must appreciate is the Russians are absolutely the beneficiaries of Chinese providing everything up to actual military support in the sense of weapons. So dual use technologies, you mentioned rations. We can see increasingly Russians using Chinese trucks and dune buggies and so forth in the war. And in terms of drones, Chinese are not, as I understand it, providing drones. But on the other hand, they're selling all kinds of spare parts that once you put them together, you've basically got a drone. And then all you have to do is add whether it's the camera system or the bomb or, there's a few key things. So again, they're doing everything they can to support Russia, but they're not doing so out of the kindness of their heart. They're doing so because it's to their advantage, both in terms of distracting and also draining the West, and also as a way of encouraging Russia's drift into essentially vassal status. But they expect to be paid. And so this is the problem. But I think we have to acknowledge the extent to which both Moscow and Beijing are looking for ways around it. And I think we're going to see increasing use of swaps. We're going to increasing use of third parties through which money is moved. And already there's some suggestions that the usual suspect in this case, United Arab Emirates, is being more widely used. So look, I mean, I think obviously Beijing is not going to take risks to support Russia, but so long as it continues to do so, and there's no evidence that it's backing away as on a state level, even if companies begin to become a little bit concerned, we see this periodically and then they work out new ways of getting around the sanctions regime and such like, because when it comes down to it, America is no more keen to start a sanctions war with China than China is to start having sanctions slapped on it. So I certainly wouldn't want to put it as kind of that everyone's playing a game. But nonetheless, there are going to continue to be very, very wide loopholes, alas, that the Chinese and the Russians will exploit.
And maybe you might think this too cynical in some ways, but it seems there is some commonality between Chinese and American foreign policy here. And that is both are entirely concerned with preventing a Russian collapse. Now, the US doesn't explicitly want Russia to win, but I think they recognize, or rather they fear, and this may be an imagined fear, that if Russia loses catastrophically, then somehow Russia will collapse, implode, and all the usual sort of scare stories. Some of those scare stories, there is evidence, are actually being propagated by Russian intelligence services themselves because it's quite a useful coercive tool. What do we make of this? That actually China and America, it seems, place a higher priority on Russia not collapsing than potentially, Russia winning in Ukraine or Ukraine winning in Ukraine. It seems the US certainly is not geared up to ensure a decisive Ukrainian victory and a comprehensive Russian defeat. And in that sense, they're perhaps pursuing ultimately the same underlying strategy.
Well, look, I mean, let's be absolutely honest about this. Every country is interested in its own self-interest, and we shouldn't pretend otherwise. And we shouldn't allow the flabby, empty rhetoric about supporting Ukraine and as long as it takes, as much as it takes, etc., to conceal that basic point. And to be honest, fair enough. I mean, the very reason that, for example, one of the lines that is deployed to explain and justify support for Ukraine being that if Russia is not stopped in Ukraine, then it will continue westwards, is actually an implicit acceptance of the fact that we are not doing this out of the kindness of our hearts. And let's be honest, also, if it's the kindness of our hearts, there are many other wars around the world which we haven't really given a monkeys about. So, I think we should first of all just accept that that is the nature of the world. I'm not necessarily convinced that America is really worried about a catastrophic collapse of Russia. I've not really encountered that in American policy circles. I think it's more a fear that a catastrophic defeat or the appearance of the imminence of a catastrophic defeat would perhaps panic Putin into some very dangerous escalation. And yes, that quite possibly would mean using non-strategic nuclear weapons, to which NATO might then feel compelled to respond. And whenever this has been wargamed through, almost invariably the internal logic of escalation actually grips both sides and things become pretty disastrous. So, one could say, well, if the alternative is nuclear Armageddon for the world, then maybe fair enough. I mean, I'm not necessarily going to argue that case, but that's where I think it sort of comes from. And so, in that context, you're absolutely right that America, like China, for very different reasons, but similarly, what they're looking to do is calibrate the process. China wants Russia to win, but not in a way that costs it anything, and also not in a way that scares the West too much. Likewise, America, and I think the West in general, wants Russia to lose, but again, at the right pace and in the right way, so that Putin does not find himself in that corner in which he basically feels that he is facing an existential threat to his own survival. And at which point, all bets are off. This is the funny thing about Putin. And I say funny, I mean, simply unhumorous, but nonetheless striking. The degree to which he doesn't make decisions quickly or well. When he's actually forced to make a quick decision, he tends to make a bad decision. And we see this, and I think this is one of the reasons why the Americans are being so tardy in giving permission to use longer range missiles, ATACMS, Storm Shadow, Scalp, against military targets within Russia. Because it's interesting, because I was talking to people in Whitehall who were convinced that, in fact, when Keir Starmer made his trip to Washington, it was going to be announced. And then it didn't happen. And then they thought, well, when President Zelensky is in the United States for the UN General Assembly, maybe then. Still hasn't been announced. The consensus seems to be that, yes, America is on board, but they're allowing time so that it doesn't come as too much of a shock to that poor, delicate Mr. Putin, which sounds awful and so forth. But, I can understand the logic, even if not necessarily sharing in it. But that sense that exactly sort of you want things to move the right way, but also at the right speed, I think is really how we explain this.
And there's the other consideration, of course, of the election dynamic in the US. And in speaking to someone who does have some links to sort of national security policy in the Harris team, now we don't know what that policy is going to be, but he certainly gave out very strong hints that really nothing's going to change this side of the election, because what they don't want is something unexpected to happen that gifts Trump, some message that gives him advantage. So it seems to my mind morally extremely cynical if that is one of the driving forces, but in the realistic world that you've described, of course politicians are going to think about the electoral impact of their actions.
Yeah, and one could actually make the case to say, look, what is more important for Ukraine? Early approval of being able to use missiles against targets, many of which are now no longer really sort of as useful because the Russians have been pulling back their planes and things. Still lots of targets they can apply. I mean, it's not a reason not to do it, but that or a Trump victory. I think, frankly, I imagine most Ukrainians would be perfectly happy if they had to make this ghastly choice to choose delayed approval for the missiles if it meant that a man who has committed himself basically to imposing a ceasefire, which would leave the Russians in control of 20% of Ukrainian territory. I think they would regard that as an acceptable and sensible trade-off. So yes, it's cynical, but hey, it's the world.
And coming back to the economy, I mean, again, there's some talk of this, but equally, there is a lot of people who latch on to GDP figures and so on that are sort of turbocharged by the economy, and they say, "Oh, the Russian economy is doing really well, actually." But if you listen to someone like the regular conversations that Michael Naki has with Vladimir Milov, you get the impression, and maybe it's a self-interested impression, because also that's the reality they want. They want Putin to collapse. They want to big up the fragility of the Russian economy. But they certainly give out sort of some figures and quotes, including from Russian central bankers, which are extremely gloomy, extremely pessimistic, and which seem to suggest that the economic collapse is rapidly accelerating.
Yeah, I don't like necessarily the term collapse because, again, it implies something sudden and catastrophic and akin to what happened at the end of the Soviet Union, which arguably wouldn't have happened without Gorbachev's well-meant, quixotic attempts to reform it. It's certain that there are absolutely pressures, and in part those pressures are precisely because at present the regime is still trying to go for guns and butter. I mean, Putin himself explicitly said earlier this year to the Russian people, "We will not make the same mistake as the Soviet Union." And what he was, talking about essentially was a state that has committed itself to militarization and in the process neglected the quality of life of ordinary Russians. And yet ordinary Russians already are suffering. I mean, the base rate, the Bank of Russia has just increased the base rate to, I think it was 19%, which is great news if you happen to have deposits. Most Russians don't. Most Russians actually quite the opposite. They have credit card debt, they have ordinary debts, they have mortgages and so forth, and they're seeing the interest rates on all of those go up. The minimum wage is going up by, I think, 16.6% at the beginning of next year, but that isn't actually keeping line with the rise in a lot of prices. So, some people are doing incredibly well because the absolute labor hunger means that, defense industrial factories are offering 3 to 4 times the average local wage. And of course, the military, there's now, very sort of generous bonuses given to people to sign up and generous salaries. And of course, if you die, generous payments to your family, which is ironically acting as a kind of leveling up process in that it's the impoverished regions where people go to volunteer and that where money is now flowing into, just as it's regions like sort of Mariel and so forth, where there's a concentration of defense factories where wages are going up. So it's great if you are in that sector. However, there are many who are not. And I think this is where precisely these GDP figures actually deceive, in that they represent an artificial average. Whereas you've got, yes, the defense sector at the moment, which is running basically 24/7 at considerable expense. And in many ways, I see this, sort of as the metaphor. It's basically burning muscle mass. But the civil sector, the bits that can't be converted and don't necessarily directly supply the defense sector, is really suffering. And it's not just suffering in the sense of having to pay its workers more, but it's also having more and more trouble getting, for example, loans, especially to subsidize research and development. It's having to pay more and more for imports and finding those. That's a much more complex process. So, what we're actually getting is bit by bit, whatever the state is trying to do, is an increasingly lopsided, almost Soviet-style economy. The old joke being, very bitter joke, that the Soviet Union was not a country with a defense industrial complex. It was a defense industrial complex with a country. Well, that may well be what happens to Russia, but it's going to take time. I mean, I think, frankly, there's 1 to 2 years before the Kremlin is faced with some very, very hard choices. Authoritarian regimes can afford to do this. Remember, the Soviet Union at peak, in peacetime, in sort of late Brezhnevism, was spending twice the proportion of GDP on defense and security than today's Russia. And although the budget prediction for next year is that 40% of the federal budget will go to defense and security, even so, that is here and now supportable. But precisely, I think the strains are going to come to a point when Putin will have to make hard choices, which is exactly what Putin doesn't like to do. And it's unlikely that he can continue the war effort at this tempo and at the same time not force Russians to really feel the pain. And I think that, if we're coming to kind of the political risks, that is when the state begins to face a real political risk. At the moment, it's okay, but hard times are coming.
And there's an updated modern version of that Russia is the first mafia that owns a country as well. I think that's whether that's entirely true or not. Now, Belousov was brought in to transform the military-industrial complex. I think we discussed at the time that the potentially, Z Patch and others looked at this as a sort of cleaning out of the stables, and he's going to entirely upend the system of corruption, which is wildly fanciful. Rather, it seems that more sober analysis suggests that he was coming in to assess, where the weaknesses of the system were and how much could be requisitioned. And that comes back to your phrase, they're burning muscle mass. They seem to be quite effective at looking at their stockpiles of old tanks and so on, logging them, fixing them, patching them up, sending them to the front. They seem to be quite good at that kind of stuff, not necessarily building stuff from scratch and not necessarily tackling the structural problems of nepotism and corruption. What's your assessment of Belousov and his impact?
Yeah, I mean, I'll let you know when I see one. I mean, this is the problem. Belousov absolutely was essentially appointed for this purpose, that he was, an economist, someone who's steeped in frankly, the planned economy, and that he was the guy who was going to come in, address issues of corruption and inefficiency and so forth, to really eliminate at least some of the profligate waste within the whole system. Now, that's absolutely necessary and absolutely sensible. But arguably, Belousov is absolutely not the right person. You really needed a tough, brutal enforcer to do that job. Because what we see is, I mean, there has been a whole bunch of sackings and corruption cases within the defense ministry. But essentially, this is the clearing out of Sergei Shoigu's old client network. There's no sense of a cleansing. It's just new people. New people are being put in charge of the rent streams that were available, and they're not even Belousov's people. This is not like the FSB taking over. I mean, they're doing the arrest because the FSB's military counterintelligence division is the relevant unit to be doing that. But that's the whole point. What we've simply seen is just simply Shoigu, in effect, sacrificing his client network as an offering on the altar of loyalty to Putin to save his own career. Belousov comes in. He has no real team. He hasn't really been allowed to bring that many people in. He doesn't really have many people he could bring in who understand the military. When we saw the last serious military reform, which was under Defense Minister Serdyukov, who was again, he was a former, tax head of the tax service and such like, had no ties to the existing military elite, no reasons to feel loyal to them. But two key reasons why he was able to actually do something. First of all, because he had political sanction at a time when Russia was not at war. So in some ways, he could be very, very disruptive without that being a threat. It's clear that Putin is not going to allow that to happen. And secondly, arguably even more important, he was part of a double act with Chief of the General Staff, General Makarov. And the reforms which took place really were Makarov's reforms. And that's the point. You might say, so Serdyukov provided the kind of political top cover in the economic nous, but it was Makarov who knew what had to be done and who knew who had to be got rid of. Belousov, he's got Gerasimov, the same Chief of the General Staff who was Shoigu's number two, who presided over much of the incompetence and corruption, who has been such a disastrously bad military commander, but nonetheless has Putin's backing for the moment, at least, and is also rather busy. I mean, he's Chief of the General Staff, he's overall commander of operations in Ukraine. Now, that's two very big hats as is. He can't also then be piloting a reform process. So, put all that together, and I'm struck by the fact that it's very hard for me to actually point to anything Belousov has done. I'm sure there are things being done on a necessary bureaucratic level. I'm sure Belousov's quite good at sort of streamlining process and such like, which might squeeze an extra percentage of efficiency here or 2% of efficiency there, which is obviously all to the good when you've got the scale of money that is now sloshing through the defense ministry budgets. But in terms of a sort of a grand fundamental reform, I can't see Belousov as the man, which obviously must be a great reassurance to Ukraine.
And Yes, absolutely. It's not transformation, it's not systemic. And that leads us to what I think still is a very clever strategy on the part of Ukraine, which is the Kursk incursion. I mean, it's much more than just an incursion, it's a big, big chunk of territory that's occupied. Russia seems to be finding it incredibly challenging to shift them. It seems that the strategy right from the start was to bring in bulldozers, create fortifications, and really kind of dig in. Now, many of the assessments that are made that I see in the media and even some analysts look at it, I would say almost as a single dimensional, are you playing chess? Are you playing this? You're not playing all these games at the same time. We look at one aspect and not at the other. And on a military level, it's questioned, why are you losing Pokrovsk? And you're focusing on Kursk as if these are the same things, as if they had the same strategic intentions. With Ukraine's understanding of the fragilities of the Russian vertical and the system, is Kursk actually rather clever because it puts much more pressure on the fragility within the political system. It stretches the Russian economy more. It stretches their reserves of equipment and troops. And it may even be designed to push Putin to something which he's assiduously avoided, which is mobilization.
I'm not convinced that Kursk is as important as all that. I would suggest that on one level, it was a dramatic success. The initial military operation that caught the Russians completely napping, and very quickly, partly by sort of bypassing, leaving for later mopping up what concentrations of Russian forces there were, meant that the Ukrainians could bite off a great big chunk of Kursk region surprisingly, amazingly quickly. So definitely success there. I mean, clearly part of this was also an attempt to try and distract effort away from the Donbass front. On that, it has failed. Putin has not been distracted. And one of the reasons why the Russians are only moving very slowly to try and challenge this salient is precisely that they're not being fed the kind of seasoned troops from the Donbass front in the main. There's a few units, but basically speaking, it's what they have available. It's basically equivalent to just sort of reaching in their pocket for and hoping there's some bit of loose change. So some conscripts from here, a reserve unit from there, a couple of air assault troop units precisely to sort of stiffen them, but nothing much. And yes, at the same time, the slow steamroller of the Russian advance in the Donbass continues. Vuhledar has just fallen. Pokrovsk, it's hard to predict, but if I had to put money on it, I would say Pokrovsk will fall. I think then the offensive will culminate. It will be exhausted, but nonetheless, the odds are it will. And obviously, from Putin's point of view, that's more important than a bit of Kursk.
And
I
Vuhledar has
think
taken 2.5, 2 years to take. It has to be pointed out.
it has. But the point is, it has been taken, and that does unlock other areas. Um, where I think the kind of the political dimension of the incursion is clever is if one thinks about when it was originally conceived. It was conceived at a time when in American politics, it looked as if it was going to be a Trump versus Biden run, and that Trump seemed to be a solid favorite. Now, if you're thinking about someone who may well want to try and impose a ceasefire on what's going on, which would allow the Russians to basically freeze the front line advantageously to them, this was in part intended to make that outcome less palatable for the Kremlin, because freezing the front line would also mean freezing Ukrainian control of Russian territory. So I think that's the I think part of the cleverness of the offensive. Now, okay, at the moment, all bets are off. We honestly don't know who's going to be the next American president. Trump's prospects are much less healthy, but not entirely sort of implausible. So that still applies. I think that the reason why, I mean, this is the trouble. People want to have an evaluation instantly when the truth of the matter is we will only know the real value of any operation once the war is over and the history books have been written and such like. I mean, I think what remains to be sort of, sort of discovered really is precisely whether or not the Russians are actually able to trap and severely degrade the relatively elite Ukrainian units which are still being deployed in Kursk. If they are able to do that, and again, if I had to put money down, I would say not. I think the Ukrainians have proven quite effective at controlled withdrawals when they need to. But if they are able to do that, then militarily, then one will question whether or not the outcome was worth the cost. But at present, and that's all one can say, at present, it still seems to be militarily viable and politically viable. We'll just have to wait and see.
And of course, it has listed an extraordinary response from Russian propagandists. On the one hand, one would have thought that the loss of Russian territory, the first time since the Second World War, would be something of such an existential level of threat and anxiety. And yet the regime are underplaying it. Like, no, we'll deal with that. It's really not a problem. It's, Pokrovsk is far more important. That also seems in some ways, now we can't know this for sure, but there are various vox pops, and you have to question how free people, actually feel themselves to give any kind of answer to someone poking a camera up their noses on a street in Moscow at this time. But there seems to be, yes, people are anxious in the interviews that I've seen, but also there's a certain lack of empathy, a certain lack of real concern. They're more concerned about whether that comes to them or affects their lifestyles. When it comes to the residents of Kursk, or Kursk as a kind of concept, there seems to be a fair amount of indifference there on the part of the populace. So has Putin actually read this quite well, that people aren't really going to be up in arms and really caring too much about what happens effectively somewhere which for someone on the street in Moscow is almost a separate country, somewhere far, far, far away?
Yeah, and unfortunately, one of the problems is precisely that when we see vox pops, it's almost invariably going to be Moscow or somewhere within an easy travel range because there's so few journalists and there are much greater restrictions. I mean, actually, there's been some interesting work being done with Russian social media by external companies that sort of scrape large amounts of it to then sort of do content analysis in ways that a very little brain like myself can't really understand. But they have registered a dramatic spike in negative messaging about the Kremlin following Kursk. And the interesting thing is that in part, it's for the obvious reasons. It's how could this be allowed to happen? Exactly. How can territory be conquered by a foreign power, etc. But a lot of it was also, for example, about the lack of care for the 200,000 displaced people. And it's absolutely true. And what's more, we also saw that there's still, just about surviving remnants of civil society also stepping in. I mean, actually, the refugees, there was some assistance. Frankly, there was a lot more assistance from the regions than from the federal government. But also, you had charities stepping in to provide assistance to try and reunite families and all that kind of thing. So again, I think what was striking was not just that Russians did show concern, but that they absolutely basically contrasted what they are doing with what the state is doing. So it did, I think, drive a wedge. But of course, yes, Putin had to downplay it. Firstly, because he doesn't want to admit that he screwed up, which he clearly did. His military apparatus, whatever, had intelligence to the effect that there would be this kind of incursion, and they just assumed it was going to be another little sort of essentially publicity raid. But also, I think that he downplayed it precisely because he knew he was not going to make this a priority. And he didn't want to basically set himself up. If he had turned, he could have tried to use this as a great sort of mobilizational aid to try and say the motherland is in danger. But at the same time, by bigging it up, he would have created expectations that it was going to become a priority to deal with, and he didn't want to make it a priority. So I think he downplayed it precisely because he didn't want to find himself hostage to a sort of daily drumbeat of reports of, well, have you taken back this village yet? And what are you going to be doing next? And so forth. A very cynical ploy, I would say partially successful. He certainly hasn't built it up to be more. But in the process, yeah, I think we can see Russians feeling that once again, the Kremlin has not really thought about ordinary Russians. Its elevated priority is about Russia as a great power, but it's not actually thinking of Russians, which is, let's face it, perfectly true.
And not at all surprising, unfortunately, given the nature of the regime. And this has been a gift to the so-called Russian opposition, diaspora journalists, and so on. There's a fantastic clip that's being shown one has to sort of, question sometimes the veracity, but this seems to be genuine. And it's a group of old people watching Maria Zakharova on TV talking about Ukrainian Nazis and how they're torturing people in Kursk and so on. And these old people are standing around going, she's lying, I'm here. They're looking after us, they're bringing us food. In terms of a gift to the Russian opposition, they're certainly milking this. But can they capitalize on it? Because this is the big problem of the Russian opposition, is actually doing stuff, taking actions, challenging the regime. They're good at the informational warfare, not necessarily the political warfare.
Yeah, I mean, look, let's be perfectly honest. The Russian diaspora opposition is in a very tough position. How do you actually maintain some kind of traction on what's going on in Russia? Or do you not even try? Do you try and sort of build up your grand plans so that at some further future point, when the regime begins to crack, you're ready to kind of roll in there? The trouble is, when has that been successful? Well, it's been successful in 1917 when Lenin came in his sort of sealed train, courtesy of the Germans. But what actually happened in 1917, the Great October Revolution, was actually the Great October Coup. It was a ruthless seizure of power by a small, dedicated, and it has to be said, very efficient revolutionary group. But I don't think anyone would necessarily regard Leninism as a great model for the way forward. So, we have to acknowledge the problems. And in some ways, it is precisely the difficulty of reaching into ordinary sort of Russians' lives and maintaining some kind of political traction there that helps explain why they continue to tear themselves apart in internecine conflicts. It's a little bit like the old dictum of Henry Kissinger that academic disputes are so bloodthirsty precisely because so little is at stake. Well, kind of the same is true. And I think this is going to be, I think, the real challenge to them. It's not about coming up with some new structure, some new document or whatever. Maybe it is in part about trying to influence Western policies towards Russia. But to a large extent, I think it is coming up with some kind of innovative campaign whereby you can actually bypass all the various controls that the Russian state has put on, whether it's the internet or just physical access, and find some ways of reaching out to Russians in ways that are meaningful. And the late Alexei Navalny, I mean, he was surprisingly good at being able to find ways of connecting. I'm not convinced that his successors have yet demonstrated anything like that almost effortless knack.
I mean, what they do share with some of those early revolutionaries, not the Bolsheviks who, conveniently got rid of all their socialist and communist rivals. So there's only sort of one voice and one core group. The Russian diaspora seem to mirror the challenges of historically a lot of Russian opposition, which is endless arguments, whether it's doctrinal. I mean, at this point, they don't even seem to have too many doctrines. I couldn't even tell you whether they're left-leaning or right-leaning. It seems to be about fractious personality disputes and so on. And of course, there is the allegation, it has to be said it's an allegation, that Leonid Nevzlin, a previous associate of Mikhail Khodorkovsky, apparently commissioned some thugs to rough up various members of the opposition. Now, a lot of people are entirely convinced by this. Michael Naki, Maxim Katz, and others swear that they have seen copious documentation that attests that this is true. And of course, it's vehemently denied on the other side. Do we still have to hold on to the idea that this may be some kind of cunning, clever GRU plot to destroy the Russian opposition's credibility, or is it at this stage, is it really not clear what's going on?
Well, I mean, the truth of the matter is it is not clear what's going on. But still, I cannot help think that if I was an FSB officer charged with trying to discredit and divide the opposition abroad, at this stage, I'd just simply be sitting back with popcorn, watching the spectacle, which is distinctly depressing. And indeed, this is not just simply a one-off incident. I mean, as you sort of suggested, it is part of an overall pattern. And we also now have Max Katz, who you mentioned, also now complaining that actually the Navalny's foundation, the FBK, the Anti-Corruption Foundation, was involved in essentially trying to allow a couple of dodgy bankers to launder their reputation by assisting him, whatever. And that Khodorkovsky is now saying how shameful it is that the mainstream media doesn't seem to be covering that. And so it goes, and so it goes. I think, look, there are several problems here. And, mentioning the Bolsheviks, I mean, remember, Bolshevik literally means majority, majoritarians. They weren't. I mean, this was just clever linguistic sleight of hand by Lenin, who, in disputes within the Social Democrat Party, who were no more Social Democrat than the Russian Liberal Democrat Party is liberal or democratic. But nonetheless, on the whole, he was in the minority, but because of one vote that went his way, he dubbed his group the Bolsheviks and the rest the Mensheviks, the minoritarians. So, this is exactly something that has a long and inglorious tradition. And look, in part, it is, as you say, that there is no clear doctrine. I mean, yes, everyone wants Putin to go and want some form of democratic structure and a genuine liberal state to emerge, which is great and admirable. But how? I mean, let's be honest. I mean, there was when Prigozhin had his mutiny, for example, there were some suggestions that, well, actually, even though Prigozhin is a violent, vicious thug, nonetheless we should support him because anything that undermines the Putin state is good. How far do the ends justify the means? There's all these disputes. When it comes down to it, though, I think we have a fundamental problem because the most powerful and wealthy figure within the opposition movement is Mikhail Khodorkovsky, who is still despised widely across Russia, seen as the sort of epitome of the 1990s, oligarchs stealing from the Russian people to feather their own nests and such like. Now, he was clearly by no means the sort of the worst, and in fact, many people, the people closest to Putin count as amongst the worst. But nonetheless, that perspective has stuck. And in some ways, that means that he is toxic, like it or not. I mean, I met the man, I've talked to the man and so forth. I think he's genuine in the epiphany that he went through while he was in prison. He's genuine in his desire to do what he can to actually bring about the sort of reforms in Russia that we would all like to see. But I'm not sure if he's quite aware of the degree to which anything he touches becomes tarnished as a result. And against that, you have the FBK, which is, is still trading on Navalny's name, and yet doesn't really, I feel awful kind of rating, shall we say, these extraordinarily brave people, but nonetheless doesn't yet have someone who has that kind of charisma to be able to really become a sort of a figurehead. So, the problem is at the moment, again, sort of everyone is squabbling over precedents, really, as well as over policy platform. And while that happens, yeah, their capacity to actually really influence Russia itself is limited. But also, final point I would make, and I'm rambling on about this, I know, is that it's also an issue about what the West wants from these people. Now, I mean, we rightly don't want to try and be picking winners and losers, because the moment we say, this is the person we think should be running Russia, we're basically putting a crosshair on their back. But on the other hand, what I think we've not really done is thought about how we can help them to precisely reach out to ordinary Russians. There's a lot more we could be doing, in part by going back to the old Cold War playbook of political war, but in part also using all the new technologies. I mean, there are ways we can be reaching Russia, not just through YouTube videos or the like, but even for things like computer games and Discord servers and such like, which, provide a whole variety of different ways of unmediated contact. And it's not that we should be doing it. It's not that we necessarily should be reaching out to Russians and saying, this is the West. Let us tell you how you, Johnny Russian, ought to be thinking. But we could be doing a lot more to help, just as we frankly failed to properly support those media outlets like Dozhd and Meduza that actually are trying to give Russians a Russian language, but also Russian perspective, honest news source. Or organizations like Riddle Russia, that try and bring the best research by Russian scholars, whether they're in Russia or increasingly emigre, on Russia. Largely these have been neglected. we ought to be thinking much more carefully about how we should help them, because if they can begin to acquire more traction, then they begin to acquire more relevance, and then they might just basically begin to get their heads out of their backsides and focus on what's really important, which is not basically bitching about each other.
Now, I found Peter Pomerantz's book about fighting information warfare in the Second World War interesting because there seemed to be a lot of innovation. And at that point, it's like you're prepared to do anything. And we haven't done anything like that. I mean, I thought commissioning a couple of series of Kukli as a kind of samizdat video and pumping that into the Russian ecosystem as political satire could be quite effective. But again, as you say, we're not doing anything like that. And on the other end of the scale, you have someone like Karamurza, who has a lot of academic and foreign policy credibility. Obviously, a huge amount of effort was made to get him released from the Gulag system. And yet, again, I'm going to be quite mean because he's been through a lot and he is a brave individual. But he seems to have an over elevated sense of his own recognition impact in Russia. I'm pretty sure that if you ask most Russians, many will not even know who he is, and few would know what he stands for as well. And this is another one of the challenges there. Those who perform well on Western platforms and with Western experts and policymakers, they really have no chance, do they, to really, if they were to come anywhere near power, could they even handle it in Russia? Could they tame the Siloviki? It seems that you need a character of extraordinary thuggishness like Prigozhin to even manage that system, let alone try to reform it, which none of the opposition really have those characteristics.
Well, I mean, I think I'd be a little cautious about assuming that. I mean, think of Václav Havel in the Czech Republic. I mean, who, in some ways, much like I think Karamurza, for example, he very much is in an older tradition of the Soviet dissident, who is not actually necessarily a political oppositionist trying to organize and structure and undermine, but is actually a moral figure who just simply says, I will not comply with these morally bankrupt notions, not in my name, and I will take whatever costs that means. I think sort of we shouldn't underestimate the power of a moral example. But yes, I think, at the same time, yes, Karamurza is not in any way a sort of household name in Russia. In a way that, for example, another of the figures who was released in the exchange, Ilya Yashin, actually was, because he tried to be much more populist and reach out. Now, again, I mean, not. Unfortunately, Navalny has left such a terrifying yardstick for people to be measured against. It's rather unfair, but nonetheless, there we are. I mean, I think, look, are any of the current leaders people whom we would imagine sweeping Putin away? No. I think the odds are that when Putin goes, we are not going to see a liberal Democrat, friendly, huggy bear Russia. We will see a transition, and I suspect we will see a transition to pragmatic opportunist kleptocrats who will want to improve relations with the West because they want the goodies. They don't want to simply become a Chinese vassal, and they want to be able to dock their yachts in Italy again without them being impounded, and they want the spare parts for their Mercedes. That's someone whom, kind of leadership we could probably deal with. It may not be great, but in some ways it marks a transition away from the increasingly totalitarian rule of Putin and his coterie of Soviet-era KGB veteran thugs. So again, I think what we need to understand is not that we are nurturing a leader in exile who is likely that kind of prince across the water to one day sort of roll into and take over the Kremlin. What we are nurturing is a culture of political liberalism and discourse that can then further take root when we do get a thaw in a post-Putin era, and then maybe for the next political generation. So it's not going to be Khodorkovsky, it's not going to be Leonid Volkov from the FBK, it's not going to be Vladimir Kara-Murza, but it's going to be their metaphorical children who are actually going to have a chance, maybe if things go well, and this is a possibility, not a probability necessarily, to actually liberalize Russia. But the key thing is precisely that we are nurturing the right kind of political culture, not a specific movement or leader.
And I know we have to sort of end up now, but it also puts an onus on the West to, I would say, not be naive, to arm itself, to prepare itself, to be prepared to deal transactionally with Russia, but not, as you say, a sort of trusting, friendly relationship. That puts the onus on, NATO as an organization. It puts the onus on our military-industrial complex, and our cohesion as allies to make sure that we are safe and secure in this new world.
Yeah, see, I don't think we've ever really been naive in this respect. In some ways, I think we've been too transactional in the past. I mean, you're absolutely right about building up NATO, and I honestly cannot see how Ukraine has the security guarantees that it needs without being part of NATO. However problematic that will be for a lot of NATO members. But at the same time, look, in many ways, Putin was a product of the 1990s. The very fact that someone like Putin got elevated, because in the 1990s, we didn't, we were, I would say, catastrophically short-sighted in our policy towards Russia. And one of the problems is precisely that we thought, well, look, we like Yeltsin. We don't like the people who are against Yeltsin, the ultranationalists and the communists. So when Yeltsin shells his own parliament in 1993 in complete defiance of the constitution, and then rewrites the constitution retrospectively to okay it, we won't say anything. Quite the opposite. We'll applaud him. When he rigs the election in 1996 to stop the communists from winning, well, because we didn't want the communists to win, we will turn a blind eye. And then we get surprised that Russians think, well, clearly this democracy is all a sham. The Westerners are all hypocrites. And, we obviously have to protect our own interests because we can't trust them. So I think in the future, again, it's a whole sort of trust but verify sort of thing in a new form. We need, on the one hand, to be much more robust. But at the same time, we also need to be much more honest. Ultimately, it will only be Russians who can bring any kind of democracy to Russia. But we have to be kind of Hippocratic in our policies of first do no harm, because we absolutely did harm in the 1990s.
That's a very powerful place to conclude. I think we'll pick that topic up, hopefully in the next discussion, because studying Maidan and these processes, it's very far from how the Russian opposition functions. The success of Maidan and how it overcame the Berkut and the violence that was pitched against it. But Mark, for now, I know you have to dash off. It's been a massive pleasure speaking once again. I think we've covered a lot of topics, but some important ones which don't get nearly enough traction in the sort of typical mainstream Western media. Thank you so much for coming back on.
My absolute pleasure. And as you say, I think you are raising topics that do need to be discussed, because otherwise they get lost in just the churn of the day-to-day news stories.